we go back to take an economic view of growth areas, and we'll be looking at economic resilience and what that means in suburbia, what that means in terms of investment attraction frameworks, and really what the state of the growth areas is nationally. And so our first speaker is Rob Hall from ID, Informed Decisions. He's the lead economist there. And he's going to run through a report that NGAA commissioned and that Rob has been working on around the state of the economy in growth areas. And it's a really interesting story. It's one of those things that when you're inside the tent, there's no great surprises. But for people who are not familiar with growth areas, I think often it's a really interesting and diverse story that they're not quite aware of. So I'll introduce Rob and hand over to his presentation.
Thank you, Bron. I will just get set up with the screens.
Great.
That's all working by the look of it. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you here today at the Symposium to really share our findings from our analysis into the economic state of growth areas. So my name is Rob Hall. I'm an urban economist with ID and have been analysing urban and regional economic issues in cities and regions for the past 20 years. What is an urban economist? Well, we focus on the location and drivers of economic activity at the sub-state or NGAA level, how it compares to other regions, why a region grows faster than another. Most of the analysis that I guess that we see is largely focused at national level or state level, but what we're doing here is going down to NGAA areas, and in this case, looking at the growth areas. So the next 20 minutes, we can discover the forces shaping the growth areas, what's driving growth, and how it influences the daily lives of almost 5.5 million people. And just some numbers to start off with, and there's plenty of those to come. The growth areas in Australia really play a major economic role. The economic contribution to Australia's economy is about 12%. So 12% of Australia's GDP is located within the growth areas. That's worth about $257 billion of economic activity. And it's not just about fast growing populations, but the growth areas are among the fastest growing places in Australia from an economic perspective. And in the last year alone, the growth areas grew by 5.1% in terms of GRP. And its economic growth continues to outperform the nation. It's been doing that for over a decade. And we can see that here back between 2011 and 16 on a per annum basis, growing almost by around 4% per year. It's been able to maintain that each year there and outperforming the national average. We saw the impacts of COVID have a temporary impact within the growth areas. They were much more resilient than the other areas of Australia, so we didn't see as large an impact. And that economic recovery has been really quite phenomenal and been a big part, the growth areas have been a big part of why Australia's recovery has been so strong. GRP in 2022 within the growth areas was around 10% above the pre-COVID levels. And we can compare economic performance of the growth areas to other types of places in Australia. So we can compare it to the central cities, like the Melbourne CBD or Sydney CBD or Perth CBD, for example. Or we can compare to the established suburbs that make up many of the middle ring places that we know about, or to major regional cities as well. And what we see here is that the growth areas continue to consistently outperform all those other areas that we have a look at. Growth's been faster than in the central city and all those other places over the period to 2019. And then since COVID, the impact's been much less severe on the growth areas than, say, the central city. You can see a sharp decline there in this growth rate, still growing, growth areas growing above 3% per annum. And really being a driver of that growth. Major regional cities are quite interesting, though. They've actually improved their economic performance over the last 3 years, largely as a result of that population outflow from inner areas of Melbourne and Sydney into regional cities in Australia. And of course, though, there is significant variation of economic growth across the local government areas in Australia, largely depending on what construction phase an LGA is in, what was the impact from COVID-19, and what's those local industry conditions as well that are unpacking, driving growth. And that's really the key thing here, is to understand your local economic story, how you build up and make up this whole growth area economy, understand those similarities and differences as well. Just a few examples there. We'll take the extremes. We've got Melton on the left growing by about 10% per annum over the last 3 years. It's growing faster than China, that sort of level of growth. But it's among a really strong residential construction phase, adding around 5,500 dwellings, approvals per annum. That's driving growth in services. But what we're also seeing is it attracting transport and logistics firms along its strategic transport network. If we look at the other end, Hume, located in Melbourne's north, its economic performance has been really weak. And that's because of COVID-19's impact on air travel, with Hume being home to the Melbourne airport. International travel visitor numbers still remain below pre-COVID levels and really weighing on that recovery. But this GRP, it actually masks the strong growth that we're seeing in the other sectors of Hume. 17 out of the 19 industries have output that's been greater than pre-COVID, and that's led by construction, government, education, and manufacturing as well. So I guess the takeaway here is GRP at an aggregate level can really mask what's going on, and being able to understand those local dynamics and those changes at an industry level within your place is again really important. So what's been driving economic growth in the growth areas? Well, one way to look at an economy's potential is really based on its population, its participation, and its productivity. And that's referred to as the 3 Ps. And you might have seen that type of analysis recently with the intergenerational report. And that report again highlights the importance of addressing our productivity performance if we are to maintain our standards of living. When we plot the 3 Ps for the growth areas, what we see is that the growth areas are heavily reliant on population growth to drive economic activity. That was the case prior to COVID in the orange there, and it's been the case as well over the last 3 years. The gains from participation have improved recently, but it's nowhere near the level of growth that of activity that's been driven by population. Employment capacity has actually fallen, and what that means is that resident employment growth has grown faster than local job growth. So more residents need to commute elsewhere for work, and that's a drag on the economic potential of an LGA or this amalgamated growth area region. Productivity growth has been modest, but really with little change between those 2 periods. And this type of analysis generates a number of questions for growth areas like, are there lessons to be learnt from the high productivity growth rates we've seen in some of the growth areas or other established suburbs? What can we learn from those economic development strategies or strategic plans? Is there necessary infrastructure to support productivity growth, particularly in those ones that support dominant or emerging industries within an LGA? And is there sufficient investment in the workforce development and training to help businesses transition or take up technology opportunities like AI and automation? And then to understand the economic opportunity as well as the challenge for growth areas, we can take a look at the economic role and function that they play. And we can do this by looking at the industry mix. And what we see here is that the growth areas play this really interesting hybrid economic role, one that is population serving, but as well as a second role being export oriented. So the concentration of homes, of course, in turn attracts local services like retail stores, restaurants, and other services as well to cater those residents. And that demand for homes drives construction employment in many of these areas. And then over time, this critical mass in population helps support a medical and education sector, which now makes up around 17% of total value added within the growth area economies. That's well above the greater capital city benchmark and the Australian benchmark as well. And then the other role played by the growth areas is the concentration of industrial activity. The transport, cost, land availability advantages have really become a major catalyst for transport and logistics and manufacturing firms within the growth areas. And these industries are essential to the success of cities as well as regions and provide growth areas with a really important source of export income, which means that the economic growth within the growth areas is not just reliant and beholden to population limits. But then there's the gaps. And so we can see that within the knowledge and professional service sector economy. These firms make up about 22% of the growth areas value added, which is well below the capital city benchmark, as well as the Australian benchmark as well. But how have things changed? So now we're having a look here at the growth in industry value added within the growth area economies between 2019 and 2022 to understand more about those drivers of change and what's emerging. Probably no surprise that health is the largest growing industry in the growth areas. It's pretty common that most places that I look at and work with across Australia, health is in sort of the top 3 growing industries in many places. And that growth's been supported by continued investment in both public healthcare at the state and federal level, along with that ongoing demand generated by NDIS. Childcare is also strangely part of the healthcare industry, and its growth, of course, has added to the overall growth in the care economy. There are a range of other drivers. Most of the all the industries here have grown over that period, but some of the other main ones include retail, wholesale, government, and education. We can see the growth that driven by the e-commerce boom that's really occurred since COVID, with a significant increase in online shopping. And you see that there in the wholesale numbers, but as well as transport. And transport probably would be much higher if we excluded the effects of air transport in that sector, and that being a really important driver over the last 3 years. But the industry that caught my attention when doing this work was the growth in the professional, scientific and technical services, which is, before, as we showed, has been a major gap within the growth areas, but we're starting to see it emerge. It was the 6th largest growing industry over the last 3 years for the growth areas. So let's just take a closer look at that emergence of the knowledge economy in the growth areas. And one of the largest knowledge economy industries is the professional, scientific and technical services. Prior to COVID, in the growth areas, that sector was growing at around 4% per annum, pretty similar to what was happening within Australia as well. But just take a look here at what happened since 2019, with this sector, the professional, scientific and technical service sector, growing significantly faster in the growth areas than the Australian average, and suggests that the knowledge economy is well and truly emerging within the growth areas. We can have a look at the census data to go into a bit more granularity, really about what sectors is driving that growth. The fastest growing with things like scientific testing and analysis, probably related to COVID, scientific research, vets, software developers in particular, with strong growth, and engineering. And one of the reasons behind this emergence was the growth in remote work. So around 20% of growth areas employed residents were working from home in 2021. And that was much higher for owner managers, not as high as the Australian average though, but still very high compared to the total, 20%. And high for females as well, more likely to work from home if given the opportunity. And we see over on the right here that most of it was in those knowledge-based sectors. But what it has also done is this flow-on impact. And so we've seen this flow-on impact of a diversion of spending from inner city areas by inner city workers. That spend has been diverted back into the outer areas where they live, which has benefited cafes, restaurants, medical and other services as well. And if this way of hybrid working continues, then we'd like to see even greater demand for growth area housing, and then importantly, a higher share of high income knowledge workers and the flow-on impacts that has. And the census data, it's the first time we've been able to use the 2021 census data to look at the growth areas performance, and it provides some really important information here about the labour force changes that's underway. Encourage you to have a look at the full report for more details, but I would just like to share a few insights from that today. The first one is around youth unemployment. So youth unemployment has fallen significantly over that period from 16 to 2021. Fell by 3.6 percentage points. It's really important, and it's been a persistent problem within growth areas. There's still work to do though. If you have a look at the gap between Australia and the growth areas, there's still that gap, an opportunity to improve the livelihoods of that workforce. We've also seen a strong shift in higher education, with the share of residents in bachelor or with a bachelor or higher degree increasing from 18.7% in 2016 up to almost 24%. So 1 in 4 people residents within the growth areas with a bachelor or higher degree. And that trend really needs to continue. The latest report from Jobs and Skills Australia forecasted over the next 10 years, something like 9 out of 10 jobs will require post-secondary qualification, and around half of that will require a bachelor degree or higher as a primary education training pathway for that group. And the growth in skills and the growth in the knowledge economy throughout Australia has then in turn reflected this increase in demand for highly skilled labour within the growth areas. One standout feature has been the growth in IT qualifications. Again, that trend needs to continue so that we can take advantage of emerging technologies like AI, automation, as well as security, IT security. One of the other features of the growth area economies and really their communities is their rich cultural diversity, which is clearly shown here by the language used at home and the diverse growth in languages between 2016 and 2021. From an economic perspective, this cultural diversity supports tourism, education, supports those global links as well, but also adds to the vibrancy and livability of a place, which again, really important to attracting higher order skills to an area. The problem, though, is that this strong economic performance and skills improvement that we've just shown there was just not enough to address those historical labour market problems, such as the low provision of jobs per resident, with many residents having to make long commutes to access employment. So our data here from National Economics shows that the job slide continues, where in 2021, there are around 810,000 more employed residents than local jobs. And you can see how that has continued to grow, even in that time of strong economic growth. And when we dig deeper, we see this job slide issue is largely due to the surplus of knowledge workers relative to the number of knowledge jobs available. And the other labour force implication of this job slide and that mismatch in work is then it has the ability to impact on the labour force participation and hours worked of a community. And we can see this impact clearly from female workers, where the labour force participation is now lower in the growth areas by female workers compared to the greater city average. It didn't experience anywhere near the level of growth we saw within the capital cities or Australia as a whole, suggesting that there's some other drivers, some spatial drivers that's limiting the labour force outcomes in the growth areas. And lastly, the population in Australia is forecast to increase by 850,000 people over the next 2 years. They are big numbers. They are record numbers. Net overseas migration is expected to hit about 400,000 this year alone. And a population growth like this will once again drive economic growth within the growth areas. As I wrap up here, I'd just like to leave some final remarks. Firstly, as I just mentioned, population growth is back and will continue to be an important source of economic growth in the growth areas. But this population growth will add to pressures on the job mismatch that we've spoken about. And without a lift in state and federal government investment, will limit the productivity and participation gains potential within the growth areas. And that has an impact on how Australia performs as a whole. Secondly, strong population growth and a slowing housing construction market will lead to housing supply issues with the likely impacts on housing affordability, which again may support stronger growth in the growth areas and continued innovation within how we deliver affordable housing, with the growth areas in particular being leaders in that front. Thirdly, e-commerce is booming, and that is going to boost industrial land demand. And that land demand is going to be focused within the growth areas. There's a really critical need, I think, at the moment to ensure that you've got sufficient land supply, well-located, well-serviced land supply for industrial businesses to meet this demand. Another driver mentioned, another driver that sort of really talks about the strong fundamentals and future for the growth areas is around health. So the health demand forecast by the federal government in the recent intergenerational report suggests that health spending will grow from 6.2% of GDP to 10%, really providing large opportunities for the growth areas to leverage. We also showed the emergence of knowledge economy and the potential for stronger demand in the growth areas given those remote working trends. And there's plenty of construction projects in the pipeline and some new grant funding opportunities available. Probably not enough, but there are new ones to be aware of and getting yourself ready for, which provides opportunities to maximise those employment outcomes as well. At the same time, though, we've seen a reprioritisation of projects at the state and federal government level as they manage debt. And lastly, I think linked to that, there's been this general reluctance by the federal and state government to address some of these spatial problems in cities, like that job mismatch in growth areas. And in my view, that addressing those spatial problems is going to be really important, though, to how Australia addresses our national productivity challenge. And that we've reached the conclusion of my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions in the panel shortly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. That was fantastic, as always. And yes, you will be back for the panel session. So please, audience, any questions in the chat.